Tales of the Forbidden City. Shadow Wars. Book 2. Written by Owner Dialer. Chapter 1. July 29th. Manhattan, New York, USA. Toothpick. The Duke was walking slowly up the stairs to the third floor of 43 Essex Street, toward his house. Although his dinner with Camilla had gone perfectly, Camilla had to return to duty. As he ascended the stairs of his house, the Duke cursed all the thieves in New York. But his mind was more focused on what had happened on the way back from New Jersey. A few hours ago. As Duke pulled onto the freeway, he heard his phone ring. The man was Coleman. Duke answered the phone and said brightly, "What's up, Coleman?" His eyes still fixed on the black Dodge that hadn't left his rearview mirror. "Not bad. What did you do?" "The chief is dying to know," Coleman said casually, referring to Editor-in-Chief Richard Fersman. "I spoke to George's wife. She suspected his death but had no proof. Tanner called her before he died, but she didn't hear what they said. After that call, George started acting strangely. Oh, and I found correspondence on his computer with an Italian historian," Duke said, not mentioning the other emails because Joanna was there. At first Coleman thought he had misheard and asked, "Is he an Italian historian?" "Yes, Isabella from the University of Rome," Duke said, scratching his head as he tried to remember the woman's last name. "Isabella Feliuoxi," Joanna reminded him at this point. "Ah yes, Faloxi. George read her article in the World History Journal," Duke said, giving Joanna a thumbs up and grinning. "How did he do it?" Coleman growled sullenly. Duke couldn't make any logical conclusions from the man's demeanor. "What did he do and how?" he asked. "That magazine doesn't appear in the United States. It's been banned from the country since it covered the FBI's hunt for commies after World War II, Coleman grumbled, still surly. "I didn't know that," Duke said, his lip curling. It seemed they had just caught a glimpse of the dark side of America, the land of the free. "This is why you're not the chief of intelligence," Coleman said, amused. "It makes sense, I'll try to keep it in mind." "He must have read it somewhere, maybe looked it up on the internet," Duke guessed, laughing. Coleman paused for a moment and asked, "Maybe. What's his problem?" He asked if a branch of the First Crusade had passed through Greece into Turkey, the Duke said calmly. "Crusade?" said Coleman curiously. Even though he knew that Duke Coleman wouldn't see him, he just said out of reflex, "Yeah, isn't it weird?" "Not really," Coleman said, again unexpected. "Tanner and his missing friend Jason White flew to Italy last week, then flew to Greece together. Tanner came back alone. Jason didn't leave the country. According to my friends in Greece, Jason isn't there. So he might be trying to do the same thing as the Crusade, to cross the islands and cross into Turkey," he said. "These men are soldiers," Duke grumbled as he overtook the car in front of him. "I wonder where they got their sudden interest in history from." "It reminded me of the Wilford incident," Coleman said simply. Duke thought the same thing at the same time. "Oh, this could be it, it's a Wilford thing," he said. Then he saw the traffic cameras up ahead and said, "I'm hanging up, there's a traffic camera, I don't want to get a ticket." "Who is Wilford?" Joanna asked, looking at Duke. "Senator Wilford served 2 terms as Secretary of Culture," Duke said, smiling as he put his phone in his jacket pocket. "Never heard of it," Joanna said, raising an eyebrow. "That's natural. Most Americans don't even know the names of all their ministers, and Wilford was careful not to attract attention," Duke said, nodding to show that he found this normal. Joanna took all this into her mind and asked curiously, "So what's the deal?" "Wilford was found dead in bed with a prostitute. His family ran up a large debt to the newspaper moguls to keep this shameful event from being discovered. But everyone missed the important part. Wilford's house contained a large number of artifacts from the countries of the Arab Spring. After the 2002 invasion of Iraq, 15,000 artifacts were stolen from the National Museum of Iraq by American soldiers. Since then, Wilfred's case is considered the largest collection of contraband artifacts in the world, Duke said with a sigh. You're joking, Joanna whistled. No, young lady, I don't, Duke said with a smile. Joanna's smile faded in an instant, and she sank into her chair, her shoulders hunched forward as if withdrawn. Don't call me that, she said. The Duke looked at Joanna curiously. The young woman was sullen and almost sunken into her chair. How should I say? He asked curiously. Lady, I feel bad, like there's a gulf between us. Joanna said in a half mumble, sniffling and looking out the side window of the car. As you wish, Joanna, said Duke, not knowing how to salvage the situation, and added, there's only the gearbox between us. Still, the road had become quite quiet. I'm sorry, said Joanna, Joanna, there are years between us, many years, said the Duke firmly, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. I know, the girl said as if she were being stabbed, but I can't stop myself, she said, taking a deep breath, and then what happened? She asked, changing the subject. Duke paused for a moment, squinting to remember where he was, then said, the Ministry of Culture and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs have closed the subject. The old journalist's mood was sour. He turned on the car stereo and flipped through the stations until he found Johnny Cash's Ain't No Grave. A few hours later. Continuing to whistle the tune, Duke was absently looking for his key when he reached the door of his house. At that moment, he saw the piece of toothpick on the floor. That toothpick he used to jam into the door every morning when he left the house, that one. Perry, whose sleepiness had suddenly disappeared, carefully opened the door. The house was quiet as usual. Perry first took the baseball bat behind the door, more worried that someone was still home. He walked quietly through the hallway and looked into the bathroom first. He checked the mirrored cabinet where the medicines were kept. Only some of the medicines had been turned a few degrees. The people who had snooped around knew their job. There were so few scratches on the keyhole of the door that it was almost unnoticeable. The bedroom and living room were so messy that it was impossible for anyone to find anything here, let alone the house itself. As Duke wondered what they were hoping to find in the house, he remembered the emails George Starn had sent him from his computer. He sat down excitedly at his computer, but as the computer started up, he wondered if the people who had entered the house had installed spyware on his computer. Sighing, she threw her hair back and got up from her desk and headed straight for the exit door of the house. Duke, who left the house, immediately knocked on the door of his next-door neighbor. First, a small light appeared in the peephole, then after a few clicks of the lock, the door opened. Perry, who had black hair, slanted eyes, a short, cute face, said smiling, "Hello Miranda." "Hello Duke, is everything okay?" the Chinese woman asked, her eyes narrowing as she smiled. Duke pursed his lips and shook his head. "Not really. My computer system crashed and I need to check my emails for news. Can I use yours?" he asked. The woman smiled warmly, opening the door wide, and said, "Of course, come in." Miranda Xiao Ying had been working in New York for 8 years. She had been Duke's neighbor for almost as long. The only ostentatious thing about her spartanly furnished home was the number of books on its long shelves. As far as Duke could remember, Miranda was not a very social person. He had never asked or questioned why. He had sensed from Miranda's movements that she was fragile, and had always treated her with a reserved courtesy. She was careful to maintain this distance even as she invited her to her desk and turned on her computer. Duke was still restless as he checked his emails. Smiling at Duke, the woman asked, "Would you like me to make you some tea?" Duke smiled at the woman and said, "Oh, that would be great." "Maybe a little brandy in there?" the woman asked, making a small gesture with her hand. "The idea keeps getting better," Duke said, grinning. As she headed toward the kitchen, Duke turned his attention to the email menu. While most of her drafts dealt with controls for topics that had already been discussed, one topic caught Duke's attention. The only numbers in the mail were 32.775729 to 35.25444, 34.444291 to 36.284409, 35.419272 to 36.429977. Thinking that these might be account numbers, Duke looked at the second email. This one was more interesting. There was a photograph in this email. He downloaded the file dsc_013.jpg. It was a man in a white suit. The man, who appeared to be in his 60s, had a black cane and a white Panama hat like his suit. Having memorized the man's face, Duke downloaded and opened the next photo, dsc_009.jpg. The photo showed three people, with a garden and an old building in the background. The first man was in his 30s. The sides of his brown hair were cut to a few millimeters, the rest was left long and combed back into a ponytail. He was tall and thin, athletic looking. He was wearing a green camouflage military parka, with denim pants underneath. Only the left side of his long face was visible. There was a scar in the middle of his thick eyebrow. His arched nose was at a right angle, and his strong jaw gave the man a cruel expression. He looked at the man in his mid-50s with a serious expression on his face. The man was the same height as him, but he was noticeably more built. His angular, broad face was regular, even impressive. The old man had his short hair cut short in the officer's style. The man in front of him was looking at him with a stern expression, and the same expression on his face was on his face. The man had the same expression on him, and he was carrying a package handed to him by this man. He had broad, strong hands. He had a hard, physically powerful body that seemed out of place in the expensive gray suit he wore. Duke remembered this man. The man was Edward McCrollins, their boss. Duke threw his head back and pressed his hand to his face, muttering, "Oh, damn it." The third man standing between them was another man in a suit. He had a dark, short hair that had been combed forward, a broad face, and handsome. He had an intricately patterned crest on his jacket. He recognized the crest from somewhere but couldn't place it. He forwarded the email with the photos to Coleman, then wrote Peter Andrew at FBI.gov in the address field and sent it. Then he found the same name on his phone and called it. He said to the bass baritone, who was obviously sleepy, "Andrew, I'm sorry to wake you, but the email I sent you is important. Can you find out who those guys are?" And hung up without waiting for the man's response. In the meantime, Miranda had arrived with her brandy tea. Duke smiled as if everything was fine and said to Miranda, "Thank you, you're a real angel." He had so many questions for tomorrow. July 29th, Novi Sad, Serbia. The Gerald R. Ford aircraft carrier was one of the newer aircraft carriers of its class. It was one of the new models that were to replace the old model when it was retired in 2030. After 5 years of roaming the oceans, it was sent to the Mediterranean. Weighing more than 100,000 tons, the vehicle could carry more than 75 aircraft. Powered by two A-5C nuclear reactors, the massive ship could reach speeds of 76 km per hour. Maneuvering in the Mediterranean with 300 officers and 2011 crew, the ship had an 82-meter flight deck. It was now at the closest point they could get to Dubrovnik in the Adriatic Sea. Gerald R. Ford and the fleet commander, Admiral Bertham, was looking at the screens in the special operations room with the blue lights on, turning the Cuban cigar he had promised to leave for his wife. He had been arguing with a fool named James Finley from the CIA since the morning. They had launched two Polyak Tu-48 Predators about an hour ago. The operator staff sergeant who was piloting the Predator said, "A-341 and 342 have reached the area, sir." The speaker was a young woman in her 20s, wearing a navy blue and gray patterned night camouflage uniform like the others. The admiral calmly took his cigar between his teeth and said, "Give it to the screen, son." The deck officer, meanwhile, was looking for his lighter when the admiral's staff officer stopped him with a piercing look. His wife had threatened to kill him with a teaspoon before he set off on the expedition. Staff Colonel Eric Kerheim knew the admiral's wife well enough to take this seriously. The tanned, blue-eyed admiral, who appeared to be in his 60s, was staring intently at the incoming images. Meanwhile, Kerheim spoke briefly into the satellite phone that had been extended to him, then hung up and leaned toward the admiral's ear and said, "The Vatican representative is approaching by helicopter, sir." He was 6 feet tall, athletic, brown-haired, and oval-faced. His wavy hair was no longer than 2 fingers. He always combed it back. The admiral only grunted in response to the green-eyed, serious-looking man. Kurheim, who thought this was a sign of an approaching storm, swallowed and fell silent. The admiral, smoking a Cuban cigar, said, "Give SEAL 6 the order to advance." The mechanical voice that came into Henry M.C. Kenzie's earpiece said, "Golden Eagle, this is the Big Dipper, this is the Big Dipper, Tango Alpha." "I repeat Tango Alpha." Henry signaled to Team Gunner Clark Yates, who was hiding behind a Tata pickup truck diagonally across from him. Yates had barely moved until M.C. Kenzie's signal. The tall, well-built man with brown hair surveyed the surroundings with his dark blue eyes. The old industrial site was mostly abandoned. The 2-story, adjacent buildings had been prepared as vertical streets on a north-south axis. Some had been demolished over time, and some at the request of the local government. The rubble of some of the buildings still stood where they were, reminiscent of a battlefield. In a few places there were factories built by joining these blocks. The tall brick chimneys of the factories, built later, looked like the fingers of supernatural beings reaching into the sky. Yates, who had spotted the chimney of one of them, silently moved in that direction. He did not like the industrial site, which was as silent as a grave. He still had the LDV Dragunov in his hand. He wrapped Dragunov in strips cut from a blanket that had faded in the sun and which he found in the house where they had spent the night. M.C. Kenzie, Yates disappeared in the darkness, immediately after the rest of the people behind him started to move forward by giving signals. The air was cool and damp. They had leaned their AK-47s on their shoulders and turned on their safety. The cold white lights illuminating the industrial area came from LED street lights. Many of these had deteriorated over time due to neglect. M.C. Kenzie, who was at the head of 5 shadows passing by a flickering light, paused and looked around. He could swear that something was watching them behind the open shutters of empty shops, in the deep darkness. He couldn't see, couldn't hear, but he felt. He just nodded to Sadric, who touched his shoulder and continued moving forward. Staff Officer Kurheim, who was watching this event from miles away, from the operations room of the Gerald R. Ford aircraft carrier, noticed that the hairs on his arms were standing on end. The man, who was opening and closing his tense hands as if they were in pain, realized that the admiral was watching him. He had been the admiral's subordinate for a long time. They had managed many operations, large and small, together. Kurheim had learned many things from Admiral Bertham, just as Burham had learned from Kurheim. Admiral Bertham narrowed his eyes and asked, "What happened, son?" Kurheim noticed that the admiral and several other officers were turning to look at him, but he paid no attention. What he said might have made him look crazy, or even lose his reputation as an officer. Still, he had men there, and he muttered, "Something is wrong." Admiral Bertham looked at the screen and asked, without taking his eyes off the SEAL team who were watching with no problems. Kurheim forced himself to think. The goosebumps, the tenseness, the tiny twitches were not a cause but a sign. Something was happening that shouldn't be happening, and his subconscious was communicating it to the officer in this way. Some called it a sixth sense, but Kurheim didn't believe it was true. To him, he knew that the untrained, wild part of the brain, the part that controlled perception, was sending signals to the brain that had been civilized and turned into a wretched creature. "Switch to thermal imaging and turn the image off," he said abruptly to the operator. Without hesitation, the operator switched the green-toned night vision image to a navy-lined image with a single keystroke and walked away. They watched SEAL 6 as it moved through the pale, dark navy and nearly black shadows of buildings. They were only a block away from their target. 4 SUVs had pulled up in front of the target building. 4 more men stood guard outside the gate, and 4 more around the building. Normally, they would have sent 3 more helicopters there to secure the operation with another SEAL team, but Serbia had made an air defense deal with Russia last year and had acquired a considerable amount of air defense equipment in 6 months. So SEAL 6 was left alone, with no support other than the eyes of the Polyak Tu-40A Predators, which would remain invisible to radar unless they fired. Kurheim approached, peered at the images closely, and growled, "Something's wrong." Then his eyes suddenly widened, and he tapped the screen with his finger. "Make this bigger, now." Everyone behind him had moved closer to the screen. It was an old furnace chimney. A terrace half a meter wide had been built on top of the chimney, 12 meters high and 2 meters in diameter, for easy cleaning. It was an ideal place for a guard, and it was empty. "Increase the thermal sensitivity," Kurheim said, squinting. When the operator turned the sensitivity down to 0.1, they saw a mass of heat, like steam from a kettle, briefly rise in the empty space. "What is this?" asked Major Mhir, who was in charge of the operations room. "Breathing of a goddamn son of a bitch," Admiral Bertham said, then turned to the communications officer who was linking up with SEAL 6 and shouted, "Abort! Stand down," and the words caught in his throat. The images were coming from the Predators, to the satellite, and then to them. That meant a delay of about 15 seconds. The signal showing the group's gunner, Yates, was cut off. A column of pure white light hit the thermal camera from across the street the group was advancing on, knocking them to the ground. All of SEAL 6 were on the ground, their heartbeats erratic. "What's going on?" the operator on the screen said. It was like lightning, to an officer who asked, just as another ball of white light came out of another store across the street and hit the wall of the store behind the group. The flames and heat waves that covered the entire street blurred the screen in orange, yellow and white. The screams of SEAL 6 members came over the radios. The force of the explosion scattered SEAL 6 in the middle of the street. They lay there in silence until guards suddenly appeared on the roofs and shot them with their rifles. While everyone was silently staring at the screen in shock at the men they had lost, Kurheim pressed the night vision button. These were Polanov's men. The men, carrying AK-47s, were usually dressed in their usual clothes. There was no place to hide on the rooftops. Then one of the men approached the men lying on the ground. Kurheim said emotionlessly, "Get closer to the man." The operator swallowed and approached the man. The man had an old camouflage jacket on his back, old denim underneath, boots sticking out of his trouser legs. He carried an AK-47 on a crossbody strap across his chest. His hair was cut like a mohawk or a punk. He reached out with his leather-gloved hand and fired a few tiny energy bolts from his hand at each SEAL, tearing their bodies apart like a rifle, making sure they were dead. The operations room was covered in grave silence. The man over the bodies turned his head and looked directly at the Predator flying at an altitude of almost 7,000 meters, and raised his middle finger towards it. Under his thick, furrowed eyebrows, the man had a deep scar from his left forehead to his jaw, and his left eye was white. Then, like a trick of the camera, every man on the street disappeared in the flickering images. Every officer in the operations room knew this man. At last they saw Polanov, whom they had orders to capture. About 20 kilometers from the bodies of SEAL 6, Polanov was driving into town in a 1990 Nissan Pathfinder. As if he had a last-minute thought, he pulled out a disposable phone from his jacket pocket and looked at the text message he had received. The LCD screen showed the time and location of SEAL 6. Smiling as he read the text message, Polanov called the number that had sent the text message. The phone company's automatic recording system kicked in and played a recording of the number no longer in service. Smiling, Polanov mumbled something as he held up his cell phone. His eyes lit up with icy blue light, and smoke began to rise from the phone. Polanov rolled down the window and threw the phone onto the street. The phone burned on the pavement as the car sped away. "What just happened?" Kurheim growled. "We have lost our entire team," the admiral growled, lighting his cigar angrily. "But how?" said the staff colonel. "So that's why the CIA was after the Serbs, the guys must have found a new energy weapon." Admiral Bertham was on the balcony next to the operations room. Looking angrily at the comm-C, the old man said, "Someone leaked information." "I thought the same thing, sir," the staff officer said. "Monitor our ship's communications. Find out if it's from here, monitor it from here, and make sure it's not there," Bertham said. The staff officer straightened his body imperceptibly and said, "Yes, yes." The mole hunt had begun. About 6 months ago. New York, USA. Meet at the warehouse. The warehouse was silent. Ernesto walked through the darkness with his hands on his hips, ready to draw his weapon. Ernesto, hunched over, eyebrows almost reaching his pupils, was one of the few Icemen who had not escaped. The rest had been wasted either in the raid on the weapons depot or in the attacks that followed. The young man had spent this time running and hiding. He was not like the others, he knew when to fight and when to hide. So he had 15 men under him now. Ernesto Jevelis, with his small gang, was in the stolen car business. The young man was neither too tall nor too big. The dark-skinned man wore denim trousers and a blue plaid shirt. He no longer wore the bandana that the Icemen wore so proudly, for this territory belonged to the Red Barons. The light from the broken roof window of the warehouse illuminated Domingo's red chair. The chair had been knocked over and cut to pieces. Ernesto drew and cocked his gun when he heard a few cracks coming from the darkened part of the warehouse. Silvio emerged from the dim shadows, showing his hands. Silvio was the only Italian in the gang. A young man in his 20s with a sparse beard and mustache, his brown hair combed back in a comb. The smile on his long face was sincere. When Ernesto saw Silvio, he lowered his gun but did not put it back. The lean, athletic young man had the fastest hands in the gang. Although the two friends had not seen each other since the gang was broken up, they heard and knew what each other was doing. Silvio Lancestria was carrying out small-scale muggings with his 6 men. "It's nice to see you," the Italian said with a smile. The Spaniard nodded and asked, "You too? Did you invite me?" The night before, a meeting request had come up on the blog site they used when they were a gang. "No, I thought you called me," said Silvio, looking around with curiosity and concern. "I summoned you both," said a third voice. "Because for what we are going to do we need trustworthy people," the voice said as both men aimed their weapons at the dark corridor from which the voice was coming. Silvio smiled when he recognized the figure emerging from the darkness, slowly lowered his gun, and said, "Hello, Scott. It's been a long time." Scott Donovan had his hands in his pockets. "Not that long, but enough," he said with a tired smile. This time Ernesto put his gun back on his belt and asked, "What are you thinking? What's this nonsense about gathering?" Scott shrugged, ignoring Ernesto's aggressive tone. "No nonsense. We should have gathered here. Because we were used and discarded here," he said, coming to the red, tattered couch. Domingo had been killed in the fight. He remembered that as he looked at the couch. He was a ruthless man, and perhaps deserved to be shot a few times. But Scott still felt a pang of anger as he thought about the real reason Domingo had died. "We're the scum of the slums," he said, "the kind of people who wouldn't be allowed in the fancy Manhattan apartment buildings. Sinners, ruthless, criminals. The bastards in those apartments throw us a few bones. We tear each other apart for those bones. We destroyed the Black Apes, the Red Barons and the Steel Claws. Last week, the Lords took the Steel Claws territory. This will continue until we, the street people, are gone and the government takes over everything." Silvio asked, leaning on the metal counter next to him with one leg. "A council," Scott said, wondering how to simply explain his solution. Silvio raised an eyebrow. "The council?" he asked. After all, he was Italian and had spent his childhood listening to Gladio stories. Scott nodded. "Yeah, we won't be killing each other like idiots anymore." Ernesto snorted, "Who will provide it?" Scott replied coldly, "I will." It was the beginning of a new era for New York City gangs. 29, Manhattan, New York, USA. "Cousin." After Duke and the banker exited the 96th Street subway station, Duke turned southeast into Central Park. He had a paper bag full of coffees and cookies from Starbucks. It was a beautiful evening, and the evening breeze coming through the buildings reached the trees in the park and made them sway in harmony with each other, creating its own symphony of leaves free from the noise of the city. A fat, bespectacled man in a suit was sitting at the entrance to the park. He smiled when he saw Duke. Duke placed the paper bag between him and the man he was sitting next to, handed him one of the coffees, and smiling, he asked, "What's up, cousin?" Thomas Perry was Duke's first cousin. But that seemed to be their only connection. He was 5 feet tall and weighed nearly 200 pounds. If Perry were to describe him in any article, he would have been compared to a billiard ball. The charming man had lost his hair long ago. He accepted the coffee offered to him with pleasure and asked, "Thanks, Duke, not bad, how are you?" "It'll be okay," he said, sighing as he sipped his coffee. Opening the paper bag, Thomas smiled and said, "Chocolate chip cookies. You're a really good person, Duke." He then saw the other package in the bag and said, "And a burner phone. You're a clever guy, too, cousin." The Duke smiled and said, "I'll tell you a few names, cousin. The usual business, the usual price. Are you all right with that?" The man took a big bite of his cookie and smiled. "Of course, just send me the names of the bosses." Duke got up from the bench and walked away happily, his hands in his pockets. Thomas Perry was a banker. He was an expert at tracking account transactions. He would be one of the people Duke needed most from tomorrow on. Duke hadn't noticed the 2 young men following them. One was wearing a loose black t-shirt over denim, the other a black shirt. Both were wearing sneakers and carrying backpacks. The young man in the shirt was 6 feet tall, athletically built, with long blonde hair pulled back into a ponytail. He wore round, brass-like glasses. He said to his dark-haired, short-haired, African-American friend, who was a hand taller and thinner than him, "You follow the fat guy, and see who it is." "I'll follow the reporter." The short one put his hands in his pockets and spat on the ground, asking, "We were ordered to protect him, why are we watching the fat one?" He didn't seem to like this change of duty. "Our master said that if the journalist does anything unexpected, I want to know," said the blond man. "He didn't say that to me," the other objected with a frown. "That's why I'm giving the orders." The blond grinned as he headed into the park in Duke's direction. His African friend simply gave him the middle finger and headed toward the subway station with his coffee in hand, while Thomas followed Perry. July 29, Gerald R. Ford aircraft carrier, Adriatic Sea. There was an unprecedented movement in the American fleet, which was 50 miles south of Dubrovnik in the Adriatic Sea. Kerheim was very sullen-faced as he walked towards the Sikorsky SH-3 Sea King helicopter that had landed on the helipad of the Gerald R. Ford aircraft carrier. When he looked at the man getting off the helicopter, one of his frowning eyebrows rose in surprise. Cardinal Vicoletti, who had been sent as the Vatican's ambassador, had not come in his black cardinal robes as they had expected. He was dressed very modernly, in a black suit, a black silk shirt and a black tie. 2 guards, dressed in black suits like himself, got off the helicopter along with American Marines. They were holding FNP-90s. Vicoletti shook Kerheim's hand tightly as he was waiting for him and said in a loud voice that could be easily heard on the windy and noisy deck, "Alberto Vicoletti." The man, who was nearly 2 meters tall, had a military-style haircut and was extremely muscular. The dark-haired man had a strong, angular, and handsome face. He smiled sympathetically with perfect teeth. His jacket bore the intricate Vatican crest. The crest was embroidered within a black shield. He carried a laptop bag in his left hand. Vicoletti, who had entered the conference room, raised one eyebrow at Kerheim. The colonel only returned the look with a slight shrug. Vicoletti smiled and said, "I guess I'm not the cardinal you expected," and extended his hand to the admiral. "Nothing is going as I expected today, Your Excellency," replied the admiral, taking the cigar he had half smoked into his left hand. "Silvio Toscani sends his warm greetings to each of you. He would like to connect to this conversation by video if possible," Vicoletti said, nodding more seriously and looking at the 2 men more closely. After exchanging glances with his staff officer, Admiral Bertham said, "Of course, Your Majesty the Cardinal. It would be our honor." Vicoletti placed his laptop bag on the conference table and opened it, opening the computer that came out of it and lifting the satellite transmitter antenna next to it and turning it on. Within half a minute, Pope Silvio Toscani was on the screen. Silvio Toscani was the youngest pope ever elected. The man in his white cassock, leaning his elbows on his old wooden desk and leaning towards the screen, was a tall, thin Italian. He was not a very handsome man with high cheekbones, slightly slanted eyes and a hooked nose. His blue eyes under his thick eyebrows were always searching. With a smiling face and a velvety voice, he said, "Good evening, Admiral Barham. Good evening, Colonel Kerheim. I offer my warmest wishes for receiving our ambassador Cardinal Vischeletti." Although the Admiral and the Colonel represented the United States, they stood and greeted the Pope and sat down in their seats. The Pope spoke again in his velvety voice, "Cardinal Toscani was sent to you as an advisor to prevent the sad events that occurred this evening, but we understand that we are too late in this matter." "I'm sorry, sir, but we have no idea what you're talking about," the Admiral said, sighing and taking a deep drag on his cigar. Vischeletti said with a smile, "For about 6 years, the CIA and the Vatican have been working together on the operation here. So, an old man of ours told us he was working for you while we were in the middle of an operation. Why are you looking for this guy named Polanov?" The Admiral asked with a grunt, having been arguing on the phone with James Finley from the CIA all morning. Vischeletti suddenly lost his smiling, sympathetic expression a moment ago and said, "Polanov is first and foremost a terrorist and a murderer. Polanov and his men carried out the Vatican attack and the assassination of the Pope. That's why Michael Richardson went after Polanov. Even though the Vatican is in the middle of Rome, it is a state and our president was killed. Naturally, we are looking for him to punish him," he said, his voice carrying the emotionlessness of a soldier who will soon shoot to kill. The Admiral felt a deep regret for not looking at Vischeletti's file before coming to him. In the meantime, Vischeletti continued talking, "But today you didn't just see Polanov's terrorist side, did you?" he asked the two officers. "Yes, he had incredible technology," the Admiral said vaguely. Vischeletti was seated at the table in a disciplined manner. He had not separated his legs, leaving a foot of space between them. Although his back was leaning against the back of the chair, his hands were resting on the armrests. The Admiral realized that this strange cardinal was ready to act at any moment. "Really? What did he do?" the Cardinal asked. "He disappeared," the Admiral said, skipping over what he had done before. Taking another drag on his cigar, the Admiral asked, "Why don't you tell us the story from the beginning, Cardinal? How did you track these men down and why did the Pope send you to us as our advisor?" Vischeletti looked at the Pope on the screen and waited for his approval. After Pope Toscani nodded, he took a deep breath and leaned his elbows on the table. Thousands of years ago, people were divided into two groups. Those who could use magic and those who did not. Those who could use magic drew their power from the Tomender Gate, which provided a connection to the world they came from. This, Earth was just a new colony to them. After a while, the corrupt sorcerers ruled and exploited the people as the highest class. Although the people who saw this as the will of the gods rebelled from time to time, the only response they received was a brutal display of violence. The sorcerers who played gods not only destroyed the rebels, but also their cities. Admiral Bertham and Colonel Kerheim looked at each other in surprise. These two naval officers, who would normally throw the man out even if he was a cardinal and laugh a lot after him, had seen the killing of the SEAL teams in an incredible display of violence on their own screens tonight. Vischeletti interpreted the Admiral and Colonel's silence as an acceptance and continued to explain, "They were always here. Those who passed through the gate while the Neanderthals were still making spears for themselves were already fully evolved humans. Those who are hiding in the shadows like Polanov now, those who are watching us, the powerful ones and those who are changed by this power. They once played gods everywhere. They were once known as Zeus or Apollo in Greece, Shub or Hebat in Mesopotamia, Ra or Horus in Egypt, Shiva or Surya in India. The task of those who received their power from another world in the parallel universe was to establish peace in this new colony and keep humanity alive. However, power made them forget their duty and made them feel like they could be gods. They brought slavery, war and famine to humanity, where they were supposed to bring light and wisdom. After thousands of years of captivity, One day the blind seer's prophecy came true and the Tamender gate that connected the two worlds closed, our ancestors' first colonies Atlantis disappeared and the world was free. The power of the gods was cut like a knife cutting through veins. Although the sorcerers could still do magic, they had lost their main power. In order to take revenge for the oppression done to them, people declared war on their gods in the sky and on the peaks of the mountains and dethroned them. Although the gods of the past could still do magic, it was difficult and time-consuming. So they ran away and hid. The last remaining sorcerers hid the spell books, the works of their knowledge, in a library and forgot its location and time. They themselves retreated into the shadows and into themselves. While people who could not do magic ruled the world for thousands of years, a blind prophet made a prophecy again. The twins of fate would come. The twins who came from the same egg would not be alike at all. Anyone who approached them would see their destinies changed. And they will reopen the closed door, they will rediscover the forgotten library. We cannot allow them to do this, he said. Admiral Bertham asked, pointing a curious finger at Visciletti. Visciletti leaned back in his chair, spreading both hands to the sides, and said, those who did not forget the oppression of the sorcerers, those who sought them, united over time. They united against those they called enemies and founded the Blackmen. The Blackmen fought for the freedom of people for thousands of years. They made all kinds of sacrifices to win their wars, they became economically stronger, they learned to do magic, they armed themselves and even the Vatican helped us. Humanity, which knows the missionaries, the Masons, the Pythagorean brothers, the Rosicrucians, has never heard of, known, or seen the Blackmen. Kerheim spat, nonsense, and Visciletti smiled, is that so? I'm here now, Honorable Commander. You are also listening to me seriously because you are now ready to believe me, after what you have seen today. I can see it in your pale faces and anxious looks. Please tell me, what happened today that you did not consider me a madman and put me back in the helicopter I came in? Because a few hours ago some son of a bitch turned invisible and shot flaming arrows out of his hands and killed my SEAL team, the Admiral said. Visciletti said, smiling again in a way that the Admiral thought was irritated. But Visciletti's smiling words did not reassure Admiral Bertham for some reason. July 29th, Manhattan, New York, USA. Firstman had been expecting a quiet summer as usual when he left this morning. He had come to the New York Times on his bike, planning his vacation next week. But now, sitting on the couch across from his desk in his office, Duke Perry was making him think the exact opposite. What exactly do you expect from this job, Perry? The old editor asked, his eyes narrowing. Duke was wearing navy slacks and a shirt, and his sneakers, as usual, his vest with plenty of pockets. He smirked, good news, as Firstman had last seen him so reckless, when he had gone to Somalia about 20 years ago. Don't be a jerk, you'll be as dead as the rest of them, he said in his usual gruff manner. That's news, Duke said, and when Firstman didn't laugh, he sighed and raised his hands. Come on, Chief. We both know someone is trying to get us to follow up on this story. Our phones would have started ringing long ago. Firstman was thinking the same thing. If oil companies or intelligence agencies were really involved, Firstman's phone would have started ringing off the hook. Still, none of it made sense to him. So, the boss is helping us dig his own well? He asked. Duke pursed his lips and waved his hand away, leaning back against the couch. It's nothing that's happened before, he said. Richard Firstman narrowed his dark green eyes until they were almost a line, and he spat, I think it's crazy. Yeah, so that's the most plausible explanation, Duke said with a grin. Firstman sighed and began to play with his ballpoint pen again. So what do you want? Your credit card, Duke said with a smile. It was his way of asking Firstman for money for the story. He felt around in his vest pockets for his cigarettes, but when Firstman glared at him, he sighed and stuffed the pack back into the ground. What are you going to do? Firstman asked, his eyes narrowing. Tanner and White went to Rome, then Greece. Whatever they were investigating, a week later someone went missing, someone was murdered. Not just Tanner, but Strain and the others. I don't know about you, But I'm curious to see what they found, he said. Joanna wondered again. Duke and Richard Firstman had been talking for half an hour inside. Joanna couldn't hear what they were saying, but whatever Duke was saying, Firstman was objecting. From his body language, she could tell that the man was really stressed and was trying to stop Duke. Whatever had happened, Duke got up from the couch, shook hands with Firstman, and left the room. Joanna quickly walked over to Duke and asked, "What happened?" Duke smiled as he continued to walk. "Agreed," she said. Joanna raised her eyebrows with her big, innocent eyes. "About what?" Duke asked with a fake cheerful expression. "About you being the reporter on the Swiss cheese-making story." "Congratulations." Joanna paused in surprise and protested, "What? No. You didn't do that," she said. She stood with her hands clenched at her sides. Duke smiled, looked over his shoulder, and said, "Yes, I didn't." Then, gesturing for her to come with him, she said, "You're coming with me." "Really?" Joanna said, bouncing with her fists under her chin. "Aren't you going to ask where?" Duke asked, smiling. Joanna shook her head and said, "No, I'm fine with you," then, realizing what she had said, closed her eyes and tried to gather herself together, as if grinning through her teeth. "I didn't mean it that way, you know I." Duke watched her with a smile. Then he shook his head and said, okay, a few days worth of clothes, your camera, your tape recorder, and your passport, of course." Joanna jumped up and down again, and asked, "Are we going to Italy?" Duke shrugged. "Yeah, that's all we've got," and Firstman came over. "Joanna," Firstman said, looking at Duke. "Yes, Mr. Firstman?" "No matter what award you receive, no matter what newspaper you work for, no matter how much money you make, never forget. You are a journalist. You are the people's only weapon, you are the people's only eyes, ears, hands, and conscience. When someone tells you not to tell the truth," he said, placing his hand on Duke's shoulder, "remember what those before you sacrificed to tell the truth." And started walking towards the elevator. "Italy is hot this time of year," he grumbled. Firstman hated the heat. End of chapter 1.